fast, and we will start in a few seconds.
Okay, starting.
Okay, I think it's time. Sorry, Alan.
Should I start recording yet?
Yeah, you can start. Yes, everybody who is recording, please start recording now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Korea's Struggle for Independence, Peace and Reunification, a webinar organized by the International Manifesto Group. I will tell you a little about the International Manifesto Group later during the Q&A sessions, but for now, let me just say that I am Radhika Desai and I am the convener of the International Manifesto Group. This event is also co-sponsored by 4 really quite important organizations concerning the subject of our webinar today. Nodutol is a New York-based community of first through 4th generation Koreans living in the United States. The Chow Collective is the diaspora Chinese media collective challenging American aggression on China. Friends of Socialist China is a platform supporting the People's Republic of China and promoting understanding of Chinese socialism. And the International Action Center for Information, Activism and Resistance, links the US militarism, war and corporate greed to struggles against racism, oppression within the United States. And I should add, there is actually a 5th sponsor as well, and that is the United National Action Center Against Imperialism and Militarism. So with this very, very serious set of sponsors, a very politically determined set of sponsors, we are set for a very thought-provoking event about imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance of the most dogged kind. We are going to discuss many things that are both at once momentous and forgotten. As we go on to speak about imperialism and its reliance on forgetting, by the way, let me acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what the world knows as Winnipeg, the city of Winnipeg in Canada, but it should also know that Winnipeg stands on the original and stolen lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. So forgetting, remembering, ideology, politics, what do we forget about Korea and North Korea in particular? There is so much, but let me just mention 3 critically important facts. Bruce Cummings recently wrote that after the end of the Afghan war, the so-called end, I should say, of the Afghan war, which was advertised as the end to forever wars, Bruce Cummings reminded us that really the forever war that has not ended yet, that is the real forever war, is the war in Korea, which for 70 years is still not declared ended. The United States, therefore, is the only nuclear-armed country in the world that is still at war and remains willfully at war with another nuclear-armed country. The United States most recently, thirdly, ignored South Korean President Moon Jae-in's request at the United Nations to end the war as a first step in the easing of tensions in the Korean Peninsula, which also exhibited the deep and widely shared desire on both sides of the border for reunification. And I should also add that, when Germany, when in 1989, we were talking about German unification, people emphasized that it should be called unification and not reunification, because the present borders of so-called unified Germany have never existed before, whereas in the case of Korea, a perfectly unified country, a country unified and a country that has been a nation for thousands of years, has been divided. When the DPRK tested missiles capable of reaching the United States a few years ago, President Trump engaged in his much advertised and in many ways quite bizarre symmetry. It could have succeeded. I think that after all, Trump had broken the mold of American politics in a number of ways. But today, but it failed for a variety of reasons. And today we are back in the old US imperialist groove. Most fundamentally, unless there is massive change in the US, or the US is forced to do it because of its own decline, we cannot expect any change in the aggressive US posture. The United States has always, in its imperialism and the imperialism of all countries, has always sought to open up economies, open them up to their own corporations and commodities, and often laid waste to the economies that they did open up in this fashion. And naturally, seeing this, fearing the prospects of this, many countries did resist. And what you are looking at in the case of North Korea is, as I said, among the most dogged resistance to imperialism that you has ever seen. So it represents some of the most determined such forces. And precisely because of that, the extent to which the DPRK is discredited as totalitarian, as autarkic, as an economic basket case led by a dynasty ruled by a cult, portraying its leaders as nuclear bad boys, etc., is simply pervasive. And to even talk about the possibility that North Korea may have some successes to report, that there may be some worthy things about that society, is to be laughed out of court. Today, our webinar will shed light on the complex and often totally opposed realities, that is to say, the realities that are totally opposed to the propaganda in the real situation in the Korea, particularly in North Korea. And today, in doing so, we are lucky beyond measure because we are joined by panelists who are among some of the most knowledgeable people on the subject. Many of them have devoted considerable parts of their already long scholarly lives to the matter. They have studied and understood Korea's history, particularly its modern history, the history of as I said, the most dogged challenge to capitalism and imperialism. So I would say prepare to be amazed, to be inspired, and certainly to be engaged. Prepare to learn the way in which independence, reunification, and peace are all deeply connected in the case of Korea. So now, we'll soon move to the speakers. I'm going to introduce each speaker as they come up. And let me mention a couple of practicalities. I would request everybody who is not speaking among the panelists to mute themselves so that we can have an undisturbed set of speeches. I have requested all panelists to take around 10 minutes. This will take us into about an hour and 20 odd minutes, given my short introductions of each speaker, and then the 7 speakers we have, and then we will move to questions and answers. When we come to question and answer, I would request all the panelists all the attendees who have questions to raise their hand, and I will permit you to ask your question in person if that's what you would like. You're also free to put your questions in the chat, and we will try to group them together in the most coherent way as possible and have them answered. So with those preliminaries, let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Keith Bennett. Keith is an active member of the International Manifesto Group, co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China website, and a consultant specializing in Chinese and Korean affairs. He is the deputy chair of the Kim Il-sung Kim Jong-il Foundation, the KKF, and the Deputy General Secretary of the European Regional Society for the Study of the Juche idea. He has closely followed events in Korea and the Korean road to socialism for nearly half a century, and first visited the DPRK in 1983 as a delegate of the delegate to the World Conference of Journalists Against Imperialism. He has subsequently visited the country on some 50 occasions and was twice awarded the DPRK Order of Friendship by President Kim Il-sung. He has delivered papers on the Juche idea and on Korean reunification at conferences in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So Keith, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Radhika. And first, I'd like to thank the International Manifesto Group, not simply for organizing this meeting, but for having the political courage to do so. Back in 1998, the scholars Bruce Cummings, who Radhika mentioned a moment ago, and John Halliday produced a rather good 6-part TV documentary and an accompanying book entitled Korea, the Unknown War. At least so far as the West is concerned, that title remains highly apposite. This notwithstanding more than 33,000 American deaths in the 1950 to 53 war, more than 1,000 British, more than 500 Canadian. And of course, that's before we think of the far greater Korean and Chinese casualties and the destruction of the whole country. American planes dropped 635,000 tons of bombs on Korea. That is essentially on North Korea, including 32,557 tons of napalm, compared to 503,000 tons of bombs dropped in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. The number of Korean dead, injured, or missing by war's end approached 3 million, 10% of the overall population at the time. And again, as Radhika has mentioned, that war has not ended. The armistice agreement signed on July the 27th, 1953, has yet to be replaced by a peace treaty or any formal declaration of an end to the conflict. US troops in their tens of thousands remain in occupation of the south of Korea. Having threatened the use of nuclear weapons at least twice in the conflict and on many subsequent occasions, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea remains on the United States nuclear first strike list. However, whilst Korea is rarely out of the international headlines, this is almost invariably in a way that seeks to present the DPRK in a negative light, as a supposed economic failure, violator of human rights, or threat to peace. Sadly, too much of the left, at least in the global north, joins in this anti-communist and indeed at times racist chorus. Having visited the country some 50 times in the last 38 years, I feel quite confident in stating that nearly everything you have ever read in the Western press about the DPRK is at least partly untrue. The left's ignoring or belittling of the DPRK is all the more striking when one considers that the Workers' Party of Korea has now been in power for longer than any other communist or workers' party in history. From 1945, predating the founding of the People's Republic of China and surpassing the Soviet state's lifespan of 1917 to 1991. From this alone, you might expect to think that they must have got at least something right, that there is something here worth looking at and even learning from. Moreover, the WPK's journey from 1945 to the cusp of 2022 has not been plain sailing for even a moment. Aside from the terrible destruction of war in 1950 to 53, the country has lived under uninterrupted US sanctions since 1945. Nor is this all. Since 2006, the United Nations Security Council has passed nearly a dozen resolutions steadily tightening sanctions on this country of less than 26 million people. Japan, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and others all have additional unilateral sanctions. That's before we come to the questions of US military occupation and threats of nuclear annihilation that have been made continuously over 7 decades. Despite this, the DPRK, to take but 2 examples, has completely free medical care and completely free education with universal compulsory 11-year education. It can creditably claim to be one of a tiny handful of countries, perhaps now the only country, not to record a single case of COVID-19. One has to ask what the country might have achieved had it been left to develop in peace. These are some of the reasons why the myopia that inflicts much of the left in the Western world with regard to the DPRK is in the main not replicated in the rest of the world. In the imperialist heartlands, there is some knowledge that the Chinese people's volunteers fought in the Korean War. But far fewer people know that in the period of 1946 to 49, the Korean communist leader Kim Il-sung sent tens of thousands of battle-hardened troops to assist the Communist Party of China in the liberation of Northeast China. That Kim Il-sung began his revolutionary career as a teenager in China and became a cadre in the Communist Party of China. That later, based in the Soviet Union, he became a commander of the international allied forces that united the Soviet Red Army, Chinese and Korean communists, and other Chinese patriots in a single fighting force to resist Japanese militarist aggression. But Japanese military reports cited his skill and prowess as a guerrilla fighter. If you visit the revolutionary museums in Pyongyang, and I hope those of you who have not visited the DPRK yet will do so once such travel becomes possible again post-COVID, you will not only be able to see all this, but also learn about the Korean pilots who fought against the American aggressors in the skies above Vietnam, and those who served in the Egyptian Air Force during the October 1973 Middle East War. Revolutionaries in Latin America and the Caribbean know that at the time of the 1962 Cuban Caribbean missile crisis, while some others were working out how to evacuate their nationals, the orders that the DPRK experts received from their government were to remain at their posts and in the event of an American invasion, to fight shoulder to shoulder with their Cuban comrades in arms. Latin American and Caribbean comrades know that Kim Il-sung's close friends and comrades have included Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, Salvador Allende, Morris Bishop, and Daniel Ortega. Revolutionaries in Africa and West Asia know well of the DPRK's active political and military, moral and material assistance over successive decades to the national liberation struggles in Algeria, Palestine, Western Sahara, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, as well as to the defense of Syria, Iran, and numerous independent African states. To this day, like their counterparts from other socialist countries like China and Cuba and Vietnam, Korean doctors and agricultural experts continue to serve the local people in a number of African countries. The DPRK has even extended its practical support to anti-imperialist and socialist struggles in Europe, from the struggles against the fascist regimes in Greece, Spain, and Portugal, to Malta's struggle to defend its non-aligned independence under Labour governments starting with Don Mintoff, through to its clear-cut support for the Irish people's struggle to end partition and to achieve national reunification and full independence. As Kim Il-sung put it in a 1984 speech, both the Korean people and the Irish people share a bitter past when they were oppressed and maltreated under the colonial rule of the imperialists, and they are still suffering today due to the policy of occupation pursued by outside forces. In a word, outside of the imperialist heartlands, the DPRK is rightly seen as an integral, respected, and essential contingent of the world revolutionary forces, one that has, like Cuba, contributed to the struggle for human liberation out of all proportion to its small size and objective circumstances. In fact, for this reason, the historically most advanced revolutionary forces in the imperialist heartlands do have a tradition of standing alongside the DPRK and the Korean people. In the United States, the Black Panther Party repeatedly featured Kim Il-sung and the Korean struggle on the front page of its newspaper, promoted the study of the Juche idea, Korea's revolutionary ideology, and sent its delegations to Pyongyang. As a not sympathetic article by a US academic put it in 2019, from its militancy to the regime's championing of women's rights, North Korean communism appeared ahead of its time and transferable to Black America. Eldridge Cleaver's sudden embrace of North Korean ideology resulted in him bringing his wife Kathleen Cleaver to Pyongyang in the summer of 1970. Kathleen felt that the anti-Americanism of both the Panthers and the North Korean regime resulted in a natural alliance between the two. In her unpublished memoir, she wrote, the North Koreans' official denunciations of the United States imperialists matched the most virulent sentiments Black slaves and their descendants felt, making it easy for Black Panthers to identify with the fervor of their ideological antagonism. During her brief time in North Korea, Kathleen Cleaver gave birth to a baby girl in the Pyongyang maternity hospital. With the help of their North Korean hosts, the Cleavers named their daughter Jo Ju Yong-hui, which means a young heroine born in Juche, Korea. Cleaver also admired the free medical care that she received during her pregnancy in North Korea. The cleanliness and collectivism of Pyongyang appeared totally at odds with the impoverished inner cities of the United States in the late 1960s. Panther member Byron Booth, who accompanied Cleaver to Pyongyang in 1969, said in an October 25th, 1969 Black Panther newspaper article, "Being here in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is like catching glimpses of the future." Meanwhile, fellow Panther Asata Shakur recalled in her autobiography that she preferred reading the works of Kim Il-sung over theoretical texts from Marx and Lenin, end of quote. Our range of expert speakers today will shed light on different aspects of Korea's long struggle for independence, peace, reunification, and socialism, why it is worthy of study, and why it is deserving of support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. That's perfect timing, and you're setting an example to everybody else. So, oh, and one thing I noticed that some of you are concerned about the chats that are appearing at the bottom of your screen. And if you want to stop the chatting from appearing at the bottom of your screen, just open the chat window. Click on the chat, it will open a separate window and the messages will no longer appear at the bottom of the screen, preventing you from reading the transcript or whatever. Okay, our next speaker is KJ No. KJ is a peace activist, an independent scholar, teacher, and expert on the geopolitics of Asia. He frequently contributes to Counterpunch and Dissident Voice and is a member of Veterans for Peace. So KJ, please go ahead.
You're muted, KJ.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be with everybody here and among this illustrious group of presenters. I'd like to start with my PowerPoint presentation. So I'll start sharing that. And I thought it would be useful for us to start to think about the ways in which we misunderstand Korea. So I'm going to give a quick questionnaire, if that's permissible, so that you get a sense of where we may or may not be understanding both Koreas rightly or wrongly. So I have a little quiz, and I'm going to invite you to just kind of come along with me and give your answers. So is this North Korea or South Korea? This country was referred to by Joan Robinson as the Korean miracle because it was growing at the rate of 25% a year. Is this North Korea or South Korea? And those of you who said North Korea are correct. Until 1978, North Korea was wealthier, more advanced, more industrialized than South Korea. South Korea was practically a failed state until the mid-70s, and it became wealthy because of its use of unusual means to advance. Is this North Korea or South Korea? This was a man, 69 years old. He told a high school girl on a bus that the government's policy to use flour-based foods, he doubted whether people would follow that because high-ranking government officials were enjoying chunks of meat and boiled egg in their soup. He was arrested, tortured, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Is this North Korea or South Korea? And if you said South Korea, you are correct. This country elected its leader with 99.93% and then 99.97% of the vote. This was their second leader. And if you said South Korea, you would be correct. This country forced tens of thousands of people into slave labor camps, some as young as 6 years old, where they were routinely beaten, tortured, raped, murdered, or worked to death. And if you said South Korea, you would be correct. I'm talking about the brothers Hyungjae-jiwon. Okay. This country's constitution was written by its secret police, who developed the country's economic plans, underwrote its loans, decided which companies would succeed or fail. The Constitution was modeled after an imperial structure to give the country's leader the power equivalent to a god emperor, North Korea or South Korea. And if you said South Korea, you would be correct. We're talking about the Yushin Honbop, the Yushin Constitution, which was modeled after the Meiji Emperor. This country had the world's longest held political prisoner, a man who was held in solitary confinement for 42 years, with his only possession a single blanket for refusing to change his political views. North or South Korea? And if you said South Korea, you would be correct. This country considers sympathizing with or supporting the other Korea punishable by imprisonment or death. Failure to report or to even turn in somebody suspected of sympathizing can result in imprisonment of up to 7 years, North or South Korea. And if you said South Korea, you would be correct. This is South Korea's national security law, still in effect. This country used forced labor and prostitution to develop its economy, including the forcing of political prisoners and their families into sexual slavery. North or South Korea? And if you said South Korea, you would be correct. South Korea used sexual slavery, prostitution, as a form of primitive accumulation to build the wealth for its economy. In the 1960s, probably up to 25% of South Korea's economy was prostitution. This country incarcerates the largest number of people in the world. And this is a trick question. This is, of course, the United States. This government banned certain Korean words from the language, North or South. This would be South Korea. South Korea banned the word labor from the Korean language for several decades. The word nodong was banned. You had to use a different word called kullo. This country said that all sympathizers to a different ideology must voluntarily register for re-education and guidance. After it got lists of these people, it killed everyone, lining them up in large rows and shooting them en masse. Between 200,000 to 1.2 million people were killed, North or South Korea. And if you said South Korea, you would be correct. So I'm going to show you a quick video about these massacres. And of course, actually, I won't show a video because I'm just going to invite you to go see it yourself. These are the Border League massacres. You can find them on YouTube from Telesur. I'll put these into the chat box. And also there's another very, very important video which was made by the United States Signal Corps called The Crime of Korea. And it shows the mass massacre of Koreans. And it claimed that these are North Korean massacres. And you see mass graves. And actually, if you look carefully and if you do the historical analysis, you realize that all these massacres are done by South Korean troops. Now, the important thing to understand about these South Korean massacres is that they were done, they started on July 10th, 1950, but on July 14th, 1950, all South Korean troops were under the control of the US military. Operational control was handed over to General Douglas MacArthur by Syngman Rhee. And this is the key issue that we face today, is that South Korea turned over the control of its military which had been instituted by the United States, and then it never has recovered control over its own military. It's something extraordinary in national affairs. It's the only quote unquote sovereign state that does not have control over its own military. And this is the key obstacle for North and South Korea to de-escalate tensions. Of course, there are many, many other obstacles, but simply the fact that South Korea, which was created as a colonial and anti-communist outpost by the United States, does not have control over its own military, is one of the key stumbling blocks to de-escalation. I don't know if people have watched a series called Squid Game, and inside Squid Game there are many horrific games. There's one called Red Light, Green Light. 무궁화 꽃이 피었습니다. Once again, you have to understand all of these games and this entire television series as a metaphor for South Korea's history, in particular the Border League massacres, the Samcheong triple purification camps, where tens of thousands of people were scooped off the streets and put into concentration camps, where hundreds died. There was also, as I mentioned, the brothers' concentration camps, the Xiangyu one, where young children were scooped off the streets, sometimes because they were momentarily separated from their parents, and then tortured and worked to death. Of course, there is the Gwangju massacre, etc., etc. The simple fact is that when South Korea was liberated from Japanese colonial rule, the Koreans recovered self-governance. They had fought against the Japanese in Northeast Asia, in Manchuria. When the Japanese surrendered, the Korean people created the Korean People's Republic. And this was anchored in thousands of people's committees, similar to Soviets. And essentially, they built a democratic, nationalist, and socialist state within months. They administered the country, they redistributed property, they collectivized the workplace. The United States military government noted that Korea had the infrastructure and framework that would allow communism to get off to a better start than anywhere else in the world. Their response was to outlaw the People's Committees, to outlaw the Korean People's Republic, and to imprison all of its leaders. So what we saw was mass suppression. The Americans put back in place the entire apparatus of Japanese colonial rule. That is to say, all the collaborators, the prison guards, the police, the army, the bureaucrats, the judges, the prosecutors, all of them were put back into power. And then they crushed popular resistance. In particular, in 1946, a revolt ended up killing 300, wounding 26,000 and arresting 15,000. And then this escalated eventually into further resistance, which resulted in the Jeju massacres, up to 30,000, possibly up to 80,000 people murdered. And then we saw the entire country crest into civil war, which then broke out into Korean War, which resulted in the Border League massacres, and then the complete and genocidal destruction of North Korea, where 1 out of 5, possibly up to 1 out of 4 or 3 North Koreans were killed in one of the most genocidal military campaigns in human history. I think I'll end my presentation there, and I'll cycle back for more questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, KJ. That was really very thoughtful and informative. I would like to request people using the chat. We are free to use the chat, but please bear in mind to sort of keep your comments to the necessary rather than simply using, attracting people's attention to the chat rather than the speaker himself or herself. So let me introduce the next speaker. The next speaker is Derek Ford. He's assistant professor of education studies at DePaul University in Indiana in the United States. Derek has written 6 books. The latest of them is called Marxism, Pedagogy, and the General Intellect, Beyond the Knowledge Economy. It certainly would seem to me to hit at some of the most cherished myths about contemporary capitalism. He is currently editor of liberationschool.org. He has led the last US delegation to the DPRK before the travel ban in 2017, organized the only US university exchange program with Korean University in Japan, and served on the program committee of the Global Peace Forum on Korea. So Derek, please have the floor.
Thanks so much. I'm going to set my timer here. So I'd like to thank the International Manifesto Group for organizing this, and especially on this topic, which is really, I think, not an easy one, unfortunately, but such a necessary one. And it's really great to be here with so many people whose work I've looked up to for so long. And I think, that if you look at the signatories to the International Manifesto Group, I think it's really quite impressive. And to me, it's indicative of a really significant trend within sort of not just the left, but in particular also the academic left. I remember when I was working on my dissertation in 2015, it was about geography. I had to engage with David Harvey's ideas. His book on neoliberalism was very popular at the time, so I obviously had to critique that. There's a just terrible chapter about China in it that makes no sense. But also, he looked at neoliberalism as a class strategy, which that's correct, but he looked at it like within advanced capitalist countries. He didn't see that, he kind of confined it there, so he couldn't see that it was part of a broader global class struggle, right? It was a capitalist class, it was an imperialist offensive, but also on a global scale. You can't look at what happened in the US or, Britain during the 1980s without also looking at the full court press against the USSR, against the People's Republic of China, and so on and so forth. And I think that, I think that situation has changed. I mean, obviously I wasn't the only one who was doing that, right? And it's great to be with Professor Desai because, I think her work has been really important for me in showing the reason why there's so much Marxist academics are, I don't know, anti-Marxist Marxists or whatever you might call them. And I think this is especially needed with Korea. I think the situation with Korea is obviously quite unique. And I think we can see why when we compare it to Vietnam, right? Which is that, the US war against Vietnam was eventually met by mass resistance, right? From broad sectors of society in the United States. And this was important, right? And the Vietnamese resistance, knew that they could sort of rely on the support of many sectors of the United States. Obviously, this wasn't decisive, but it was nonetheless significant. But the situation with Korea was so different because it's not that the war against Korea was popular then or that it's popular now, right? But it's that, obviously it's called the Forgotten War in the United States. So we name it in an attempt to forget it, right? But because after the end of World War II, the imperialist rivals had really been, decimated. And so there was really only the United States, which is the sole superpower remaining. It was able, rather than to sort of punish its former enemies, right? It sort of rehabilitated them and regrouped them under its wing and united them, created a united front of sorts against a new enemy, which was communism. And there was immediately an intense wave of repression in the United States. So the leadership of the Communist Party, which was quite significant at the time, they were all arrested, they were imprisoned, there was the blacklisting in the McCarthy era. And in August of 1950, just a couple of months after the US again invaded Korea, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were accused of espionage and threatened with the death penalty. And they were active in the anti-war movement at that time. And when the Rosenbergs were sentenced to death the next year, the judge, Irving Kaufman, told them that the communist aggression in Korea and all the casualties were basically their fault, right? So that's kind of the atmosphere in which the historical memory of the war against Korea is carried with us today. And even with the resurgence of left politics, which demanded a left presence of intellectuals and academics in universities, it seemed like, to me, the deal was like, you can be a Marxist, but as long as you denounce every actually existing socialist project ever and in the future, right? And that seems to me sort of, in many ways, a dominant trend, but I do think that that's changing as a result of the shifting balance of forces across the globe, and the rapid shifting of consciousness. You know, I think there's a very popular clip of Vijay Prashad engaging with David Harvey at the People's Forum that was, wildly popular. And I think that, the International Manifesto Group sort of popularity also signals this, and it's something that, it's not qualitatively dominant, but it is, either, but it has a potential to be. And I think that, so really with the starting point for Korea, for me, is always just that the sovereignty and the independence of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea should be respected. There should be a peace treaty, right? And I think that should be like really not controversial. And that's sort of where we should begin, right? And as a sovereign and independent country, they should be allowed to have a military. They should be allowed to, pursue the development of weapons, the testing of weapons as their choice. DPRK has never invaded another country or bombed another country. It doesn't have foreign bases in other countries. It doesn't send military advisors to help train Contra groups in other countries. And so that's the starting point of the discussion. I think where the discussion should be sort of oriented really has to do with what's our evaluation of the social, political, and economic system in Korea. And that doesn't mean that we have to have a position on every single policy or, historical development in the Workers' Party of Korea or with the state or anything like that. It also doesn't mean that we have to critique every single thing. I think maybe once we make a revolution in the United States, we could turn our attention to that. So we have to acknowledge that our words have effects, And so how should we understand the DPRK? I think as Marxists, Marx opens the first chapter of the first volume of Capital saying that, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense accumulation of commodities. And it's often remarked that he says appears because obviously it isn't that, right? There's something else. But what I think is most significant is the fact that he's talking about the capitalist mode of production prevails. He doesn't say it's dominant, or doesn't say it's exclusive, rather, right? It prevails even when he's writing it. Right? He's sort of isolating and abstracting this thing called capital, right? Which exists with other modes of production that are blocked together. And I think that whenever Marx develops laws, right, as a result of that, they're never like hard and fast laws. They're always conditional. He says, here's a law. And then he says, it's modified in its working by like all these other circumstances, right? So it's not as if there's like it's not like the law of gravity, which also is modified in its conditions, because if you go to, other planets, the law of gravity doesn't hold. But, the laws are derived from the actual struggle itself, right? And in Korea, that struggle is a struggle for socialism, and it's a struggle for national liberation, which includes the struggle for reunification or unification. And I think, I really enjoyed both presentations, but when KJ was talking about the political prisoners, I was able to interview, and I met several times, a man named An Hak Sap, who was from the South, what was eventually the South, and eventually joined the Korean People's Army during the war against Korea. And he was captured in the South. And he remained a prisoner until 1995. And he could have been released at any point in time if he had just renounced Juche, if he had renounced communism. And they offered, they tried to bribe him. He would have had a great life if he had done that, right? But he didn't. And he was eventually released, along with a couple of other political prisoners of war. And some of them went to return to the North after the June 15th summit in 2000. And he didn't. And I asked him why, and he said, well, one, I thought it would be temporary, right? Nobody thought that it would, and it will be temporary, right? Korea will be reunited. But he also said, I came here to liberate my country and I'm not going to leave until I do. And I think that's incredibly significant because if he went to the North, he would be like, he would also live a very good life, right? He would, he is a hero. He would be treated as a hero. And instead he continues to live under intense repression in the South. And it's quite old, 90, 91 years old, but still attends protests every day, is still so active in the movement. And you can't really understand why somebody would do that, or rather, I think knowing that story gives you sort of a sense of the reason why the DPRK is such an inspiration to so much of the world and also such a thorn in the side of the United States. Because the historical articulation of those two struggles, right? It varies a lot over time, but, in the 1950s in particular, there were cultural, ideological, and also economic debates happening within Korea and within the world communist movement that were incredibly significant. In terms of culture, the DPRK shares a border with what was the USSR, the People's Republic of China, and there were different factions which wanted to, and those two powers were engaged in increasing polemics against one another. Different factions wanted to follow different leaderships, not only in terms of economic development, but in terms of culture. That we should adopt Soviet socialist realism, right? Or different forms of cultural practices and expressions. And Kim Il-sung, in his 1955 speech, explicitly articulates Juche, sort of most explicitly, it says it like, look, we don't even know about Korean culture and Korean history, right? That's what we need to be studying. And then there were debates about post-war economic development, right? One side said we should focus on just consumer goods and agriculture. One side said, that was 10 minutes. Can I have like 2 more minutes? Okay, just tell me what's up. The other one should focus on heavy industry, military reconstruction, and so on and so forth. And it was the latter one that won out because it had to do with overcoming foreign dependency and the legacy of neo-colonial or colonial underdevelopment. And this is why the Cubans look to the North, because the economic development was based and predicated upon what Kim referred to as unleashing the great revolutionary enthusiasm of the people, right? That it wasn't as if you just create material productive forces and then consciousness changes, right? Both of those things were pursued at the same time. And that still guides, the party today. The most recent party Congress in December of last year, and by the way, they've increased in frequency most recently. It maintains this, but you also see that there's such a great degree of flexibility and pragmatism within it. And so, including, the shift in language from military deterrence to military balance. So, I think the thing is we have to see Korea not as we want to see it or as we would love to see it, but as it actually is. And that's where our position should come from. And as people who are advocating for peace and justice, that we have to sort of not only defend the DPRK's right to exist as an independent nation, but also its social system. I think that, we can make it so that that's the sort of consensus on not just the left or the academic left, but the entire US population. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Derek. Our next speaker is Xiangyu. Xiangyu Zhong. Xiangyu is a Marxist-Leninist political commentator and a Chinese hip-hop artist based in Taiwan province. And anti-imperialism and class struggle are common themes in his music. So Xiangyu, please have the floor.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start off by thanking all parties involved in putting together this event, and also everyone attending for taking your valuable time to listen to us speak. It's truly an honor to be included among all of these amazing speakers and friends of the DPRK. My name is Xiangyu, and I like to think of myself as an amateur political commentator. And some of you might know me as a Marxist-Leninist rapper or the guy who shot a pro-DPRK music video in the country with a selfie stick, which I guess is a little bit relevant since I was invited to speak at this event by Carlos, who knows me through my work and is working with me on my next album. Anyways, enough about myself. When I wrote this presentation, I did so with the assumption that the other speakers here will talk about the origins of the Korean conflict, how the imperialists divided Korea and formed a separate regime in South Korea against the will of the Korean people, and other information pertinent to understanding the present situation in Korea. So today I would like to focus my presentation on what it means to support the DPRK's just struggle against imperialism and why it is important. But before I begin, I'd like to recommend a few very basic books to those interested that I believe will help people better understand the Korean War, the ongoing Korean conflict, as well as get a glimpse of what life is like in North Korea. They are namely The Korean War 1945 to 1953 by Hugh Dean, A Capitalist in North Korea by Felix Zapt, and two books by Bruce Cummings, The Korean War, A History, and North Korea, Another Country. Of these four books, and three authors, only Hugh Dean is a communist. So for those who care, these books are by no means propaganda from Pyongyang. And a book I recommend for understanding the basics of imperialism are Rogue State by William Bloom, Against Empire by Michael Pereni, and Black Shirts and Reds by the same author. Another thing is, if everything goes as planned, I will be moving to Beijing and going to the DPRK often for work. So if you're interested, you can follow me on social media to see some of what I'll be seeing if and when it happens. So one of the first things I want to address is this. It's no secret that Western media often runs very sensational stories about North Korea grounded in zero facts whatsoever, such as claiming that Hyun Sung-woo had been executed only for her to miraculously come back to life later, or women claiming that everyone is required to get Marshal Kim Jong-un's haircut, then claiming that nobody but Kim Jong-un is allowed to have that haircut. The imperialists are determined to portray North Korea as some sort of living hell because the Workers' Party of Korea has the audacity to do the unthinkable, which is to refuse to kowtow to Washington and to lead the country on terms set by the Korean people. On the flip side, though, and I don't think this is addressed enough by those of us who are pro-DPRK, is the fact that there are some people who try too hard to do the exact opposite, which is to paint North Korea as some sort of workers' paradise without any problems, and that the people there are basking in all sorts of individual freedoms unknown to much of the rest of the world. This lack of context and nuance, in my personal opinion, does not help our anti-imperialist cause or the DPRK at all. After all, how can a country that is clearly impacted by some of the most brutal economic and political sanctions known to human history be heaven on earth when those sanctions have been effective in crippling the economy? I recommend Felix Zapt's book, A Capitalist in North Korea, because his book explains pretty well how sanctions work from the perspective of someone who's lived in North Korea for, I believe, 7 years and dealt firsthand with those sanctions as he tried to conduct his business. To put things simply, I want you to imagine two people from two families. One grew up in an affluent family while the other grew up in poverty. All else equal, I want you to think, which person objectively has more freedom? Think about the rich kid. When he grows up, he can choose whether or not he wants to go to college or take a backpacking trip around the world to find himself or whatever. Or he can try to start a business and then become even more affluent if successful, or fail, then decide to go to grad school and then work for Jeff Bezos or whatever. Basically, his choices are underachieving his way through life, through a comfortable life, or put in some effort and live an extremely comfortable life, at least from a material standpoint. Now, the poor kid, think about his options. He might be forced by circumstance to forego college and work some difficult, low-paying job in order to support his family, whether it be his parents, siblings, or children, whatever. And keeping a family together and functional under those conditions takes a lot of discipline and sacrifice. But it also makes people really resilient at the same time if successful. And so if we zoom out onto a more macro level, we'll find that concepts like universal freedoms didn't exist in much of humanity until a certain level of economic development. In more primitive societies of the past, with less developed modes of production, society could not afford to just let everyone do whatever they want and not work. Without a certain level of discipline, the entire society will fail to produce food and sustain itself and crumble as a result. And this is even if there aren't hostile forces surrounding it. Now, I'm not saying that the DPRK today is such a society, nor am I saying that the DPRK does not have rule of law and is some sort of Orwellian hell. But it is true that for a society that is under siege by hostile forces to survive, that the discipline of the masses is very crucial. And I want to put this into perspective so we can understand why certain phenomena exist in the DPRK. Because aside from blatant lies about North Korea, like the word love not existing, a lot of anti-DPRK propaganda works by pointing out and exaggerating things that can be observed and divorcing them completely from their context. One example would be the internet not being available to most people in the DPRK. For most people in America, this is an unimaginable disregard for personal freedom, while many in the developing world also lack internet access, not necessarily because they're not allowed to have it, but because they don't have the infrastructure. So to someone in a very poor country who does not have internet, is it that ridiculous for the people in North Korea to not have it? This is one thing to think about. Another is that it is undeniable that imperialists have a history of attempting to destabilize and overthrow governments that refuse to be subservient to them, using tools like mass media and the internet. We've seen this attempted in Cuba very recently. And one of the most active organizations involved in the destabilization campaign against Cuba was the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED, which funds and trains selected political organizations, movements, and media all over the world to advance US interests. The NED has even openly admitted to meddling in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region since early 2000s. In fact, the World Uyghur Congress is almost entirely funded by the NED. Celebrity defector Park Yeon-mi works for a right-wing think tank, the Atlas Network, which is funded in part by the NED, in addition to, ExxonMobil, Koch Industries, as well as other companies and organizations. So if we look at the NED's record of undermining the sovereignty of other countries and think about how our understanding of countries unwilling to submit to the imperialist will of Washington are shaped by our media, then even if we disagree with North Korea limiting internet access to its citizens, we can at least understand where they're coming from. And even if we disagree with certain policies of the DPRK, such as this one, it is important to understand that as foreigners, especially people living in the US, that the only relevant position for us to hold if we truly care about the well-being of the Korean people in North Korea is to stand opposed to the US's hostile policies against the DPRK. And this holds true even if you do believe the worst things said about the DPRK by the media. I know some might ask why it's okay for the DPRK to go to these extremes to defend their sovereignty, while the US allows us to go on whatever website we want and organize events such as the one we're attending right now. And this is a very valid question. However, we cannot deny that when more than half of the world's media are owned by US corporations, the US's strength in propaganda is disproportionately more powerful than those of countries like Korea and Cuba. One is on the offense, while the other is on the defense. And when a country lacks soft power, it's forced to defend itself with hard measures. This is very important to consider when economic sanctions are designed to cause dissatisfaction among the people, with the hope that they'll shift the blame onto their government. If we think about people suffering from sanctions as fuel, then regime change propaganda disseminated into the target country by imperialists is like a flame. And we should not forget how quickly freedoms can disappear in America when people organize in a serious way. In 1950, the Internal Security Act was passed, and in it was an emergency detention provision that gave power to the US government to throw suspected communists into concentration camps should an emergency situation be declared. This was back when the Communist Party of the USA had been a formidable force in the United States for a few decades, and when the international communist movement was strengthening on the international stage. If you want to learn more about this history, I highly recommend checking out a book by Harry Haywood titled Black Bolshevik. Back then, organized labor in the US was still able to effectively wring concessions from the ruling class, though it was also around this time that years of right opportunism in the CPUSA began to really erode the party from within. The emergency detention provision would not be repealed until 1971. And also, think about how closely the FBI monitored the activities of organizations like the Black Panthers or the Young Lords, and dismantled these organizations with scant regard for the rule of law or the niceties of so-called liberal democracy. Fred Hampton was savagely murdered by the state, and Assata Shakur, to this day, remains in exile as a political refugee in Cuba. Today, we can freely talk about communism online. To be perfectly honest, because the state of the organized left in the US is very weak and does not pose a threat to the US any longer. But if one day there is a mass communist movement that is disciplined and organized, you can bet that the state will take away our freedom to be open communists, whether our state is run by, whereas our state is run by monopoly capitalists, also known as the imperialists, to protect their interests that run counter to the interests of the vast majority of the people around the world. The DPRK is run by revolutionaries who fought for the national liberation of the Korean people against the Japanese and American invaders, who are doing their best to protect it. And these people are doing the best to protect the interests of the broad masses of the Korean people. And they're regrettably forced by circumstance to run their half of the country with levels of discipline unimaginable to us simply to survive. If we want to see the Korean people enjoy more relaxed lives, then we should call for the imperialists to seize their economic, political, and military aggression against Korea. When we as foreigners fail to view US imperialism as a primary contradiction in this situation, and instead focus our energy on denouncing the DPRK, we are in reality justifying further aggression against Korea and hence supporting a US-led regime change operation. Unfortunately, this view is nearly universally dismissed by the entire political spectrum in the West, even among many self-described socialists, communists, and anti-imperialists. I've seen self-described leftists call for the assassination of Marshal Kim Jong-un in order to save the North Koreans. But even if every lie told about the DPRK and Kim Jong-un were true, and they're not, but let's just assume for the sake of argument, we need to ask ourselves this very important question. When and where has US-sponsored regime change ever resulted in more freedom and democracy for the people of the targeted country? Did Iranians become more free after Mossadegh was overthrown? Did Chileans live better lives after Allende was ousted and Pinochet was installed? Let's look at Libya. It used to be a country where people of neighboring countries went for opportunities back when Gaddafi was around. After his murder by the US, people are running away from it in hopes of finding better lives. Ever since the end of the Second World War, the US has overthrown countless governments, many of which were democratically elected, in order to protect its hegemony. Some of these countries include, but are not limited to, Iran, Guatemala, Iraq, Cambodia, Libya, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, and Haiti. Furthermore, can we even make the argument that North Korea is the aggressor in its relationship with the US? People often point to the fact that the DPRK withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty back in 2003 as proof that they're warmongering terrorists. But what's often forgotten is that the UN Security Council Resolution 984 acknowledges pledges by the 5 nuclear weapon states to not use or threaten to use nukes against non-nuclear parties of the NPT. And while Bush invaded Afghanistan and was preparing to push for war in Iraq, the US was also running simulations on carrying out preemptive nuclear strikes against North Korea, which I think we can all agree is tantamount to a threat, and that the DPRK was justified in pursuing a nuclear deterrent. So the problems of countries like the DPRK that are targets of US imperialist aggression, whether they're real or imagined, cannot be used as justification for us to withhold our international solidarity. I think a recurring thing in what I've said today is that problems like limited freedom of expression in countries on those of the receiving end of imperialist aggression are often exacerbated, if not caused by the imperialist aggression itself. If we truly care about the people in North Korea and we genuinely want them to thrive, then we must do our part to stand up against the military aggression, economic sabotage, and political isolation carried out right here in the United States. All other positions, including drawing false equivalencies like saying Kim Jong-un and Biden are both bad, so we should support neither, or the liberal savior advocating of intervention or color revolution, are simply expressions of imperialist chauvinism that leave the door wide open for further imperialist aggression. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Xiangyu, and I'm very sorry to have to cut you off. Personally, I could have listened to you for a lot longer, but I have to keep the time. Our next speaker is Dr. Hugh Goodacre. Hugh is a lecturer in the Department of Economics at University College London and director of the Institute of Independent Studies. The IIS promotes the study and application of ideologies of national and social emancipation, particularly those created by oppressed peoples through their own struggles, locating them in a non-Eurocentric conception of scientific socialism. He founded the Korea Friendship Society in the UK in 1982 and served as Joint Secretary for many years. He first visited the DPRK in 1983 and is one of a handful of UK citizens to have engaged in extensive discussions with President Kim Il-sung. Decades of work on Korean affairs have embraced people-to-people exchanges, anti-sanctions campaigning, and research on and study of the Juche idea. His most recent publication, which is on a very different subject, is The Economic Thought of William Petty, exploring the colonialist roots of economics, and it's just been published by Routledge. So Hugh, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be talking about the Juche idea. Now, what good are Marxists? That was a question posed to me by Alan Freeman 15 years ago. Don't know if you remember that, Alan. as we rather gloomily reflected upon the fact that the greatest grief and obstruction we had each faced in our respective professional, academic and political life had in all too many cases been inflicted upon us by Marxists. And yet all we wanted to do was to follow in the path charted by Karl Marx. The Korean ideology of Juche, the Juche idea, responds to a somewhat analogous situation at the global level, where it has likewise, ever since its origins, interacted closely with the great debates of socialism. The origins of the Juche idea are inextricably linked to the response by Korea's great leader, Kim Il-sung, to issues arising in the context of revolutionary party building, not least of which concerned a critical assessment of the Third International's interaction with the various currents within Korean communism. The public enunciation of the Juche idea as a distinct approach within the socialist camp was a central element of Kim Il-sung's response to the growing tensions and polemics between the Soviet and Chinese parties from the late 1950s onwards. Kim Il-sung's explicit formulation of the content of the Juche idea was in the first instance a response to the growing demand of progressive circles around the world to better understand how People's Korea had successfully sustained such unity among its people around its indomitable and consistent anti-imperialist stand. They wanted to understand how Korea had managed to sustain its relations with the governments and communist parties of both China and the Soviet Union at a time when most of the world communist movement had got swept into one camp or another, and had avoided the factional splits and schisms which might understandably have led to many asking Alan's question about Marxists. By the 1980s, and indeed before, the Korean people who had never known any other leadership but that of Kim Il-sung had to face the question of succession to that leadership. And on that matter, the only thing on their minds was how to sustain continuity. A comprehensive elaboration and systematization of his thinking so that it could be carried forward into the following generations was therefore a major issue for party, people, and state. Before looking at the response to this requirement, which was led by Kim Jong-il, I'd like to recall a comment which Carlos Martinez made to me to the effect that we should assess the ideas and ideologies originated within anti-imperialist movements of the world, not according to some preconceived standpoint or blueprint, but according to their success or otherwise in contributing to the mobilization of their peoples against imperialism. I hope I've got that right, Carlos. In this category of anti-imperialist ideas and ideologies, one could compile an enormous great list. For example, there are those named after the leaders who originated them, Nkrumahism, Guevarism, Chavismo. Today, we see biosocialism of Bolivia, Ujamaa of Tanzania, the Green Book ideology of Gaddafi. Actually, in our country, the most distinguished anti-imperialist, indeed insurrectionary movement that we have seen in our lifetime has been the Irish Republican movement in England and indeed in Ireland, whose ideology rests on the heritage of the life and writings of such leaders of James Connolly and Padraig Pearse. Also, in our country, we've experienced the reverberations of the world's Black Power movements with their associated ideas generated by such individuals as Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, and movements such as the Black Panthers. The list, one could go on and on adding to that list, I'm sure. Now, it has proved difficult for Marxists to appreciate the significance of the Juche idea due to the difficulty they've faced in widening their intellectual points of reference beyond those which were available to Marx in his time, which were the Western intellectual traditions of German dialectics, French socialism, and English political economy. In contrast, the Juche idea takes as its intellectual and ideological point of reference this new universe of anti-imperialist ideas, ideas of independence, among which it's distinguished by its uniquely long-standing and close interaction with the great debates of socialism. Returning to the response of Kim Jong-il to the requirement to systematize the Juche idea, this involved a project of philosophical, social scientific, and theoretical activity, which is surely unique in its scope and sophistication among all progressive ideologies which are not explicitly and exclusively situated within the Marxist tradition. A prominent aspect of this activity was to identify points of continuity and originality with respect to received ideas within the socialist tradition. As for continuity, this is quite simply the shared project to follow in the path charted by Karl Marx. As for originality, the Juche idea had pointed out that it was addressing questions which only arose in the new conditions in the world following the October 1917 revolution, which had raised socialist practice to a new level in which the people of a wide variety of different societies were increasingly able to assert their true nature as the subjects of history, building new societies that were transforming the world in accordance with their own interests. On the philosophical front, the original contribution of the Juche idea was defined as posing a new fundamental question for philosophy. The age-old question addressed by philosophy, the relation of consciousness to matter, had long since been definitively answered by Marx and Engels. The Juche idea, which is predicated upon that achievement, was now posing the new question, the relation of people, or man, to the world, a relation of mastery in which people transform the world in their own interests. Now, if Marxists cannot get their imagination around ideological achievements coming from within such a powerfully anti-imperialist intellectual tradition, then they shouldn't complain. I mean, whose fault is that? In 1990, I had the privilege of discussing the potential interlinkage of these ideologies, most particularly those with which we interact most directly in this country, such as the Irish Republican movement and Black Power movements, with Kim Il-sung himself. Actually, I think the meeting was supposed to be between Kim Il-sung and Keith Bennett, but the Koreans had to put up with me in the chair on that occasion. Anyway, I was there along with Muhammad Arif, General Secretary of the British Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization. So what we discussed at this meeting was an Irish Republican rally which had recently taken place in London, where Muhammad Arif had made a speech where he had drawn out precisely some of these ideological links. We also mentioned actually that Chung had been in London at the time and had delivered a speech there. So at which he had expressed the mutual solidarity between Ireland and Korea, to which Keith Bennett referred at this meeting today. And we really felt we were at the heart of this great global process of the interaction and fusion of anti-imperialist ideas and ideologies of our time. Kim Il-sung listened intently to what we were saying and commented favorably on what Muhammad Arif had said. So there we are. Juche idea has been my life really, since, along with Keith Bennett, I started studying it even from the 1970s. And eventually, it actually dictated my big choices in life. I left my job as a librarian, went back to university, struggled my way back up to being a lecturer at University College London in the history of ideas. So if you want to be convinced that the Juche idea is indeed something original, and if which I don't recommend, you make the decisions on the authority of old academics, then you can take it from me. But that's not a very serious option. I just hope what I've said could convince you, encourage you to take the study of the Juche idea seriously as a valuable guide in your practical activities in the struggle against imperialism.
Thank you so much, Hugh. That was very good and also very good timing. So let's get on with our next speaker. We have two further speakers, and the next speaker will be speaking with us on a pre-recorded video. It's Dr. Kiyul Chung, who is a lifelong fighter for Korean reunification and anti-imperialist causes generally. He is editor-in-chief of The 21st Century and a visiting professor at a number of universities, including Beijing's Tsinghua University, Tokyo's Korea University, and Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung University. Earlier, he was also a visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Chung was born in Korea, left to do graduate studies in the United States, and then was based in the United States for about 25 years while earning his MA and PhD degrees and playing a major role in the progressive Korean community. He returned to Korea in 2005 as adjunct professor of the Methodist University and senior lecturer at Hanshin University, both in Seoul, but then moved to Beijing to take up academic posts there. Dr. Chung was a key organizer of the 1989 International Peace March for the Korean reunification that aimed to march from the northernmost to the southernmost points of the Korean peninsula, but was prevented from crossing the demilitarized zone by US occupation forces and by the South Korean authorities, as well as the Korea Truth Commission's International War Crimes Tribunal, held in New York in 2001. That is to say, he was a key organizer of that. With a background in religious philosophy, Dr. Chung's book include The Dongchak Concept of God, Heaven, Religion and Social Transformation, which by presenting Dongchak, the origin of indigenous Korean Chondoist religion, is a case study of religion, of the role of religion in social transformation. It examines why Korean religious and intellectual traditions have been almost non-existent, and if existent, distorted, misrepresented, and misunderstood in Western religious and philosophical studies. So let's listen to Dr. Kiyul Chung.
Warm greetings to brothers and sisters. I'd like to spend most of my time to share some of the issues I have had in mind. For some of you, my background is about the more than 40-year-long my non-stop commitment on Korea issues and beyond, in terms of the anti-imperialist self-determination we call the struggle for the anti-imperialist and self-determined struggle we all have endured, we all have carried out at best. These points on a brief one-page summary, I see Korea issue within the context of a 5-century-long history of the unipolar world of imperialism or colonialism. I see Korea issue, they often talked about the US and the North Korea or US DPRK, US relations. This relationship, these relations that the humanity, I argue, has never heard about such a struggle. The longest ever, the war still continues, haven't yet finished. Since 1953 July, the armistice agreement was signed. Still, the war between the DPRK and United States hasn't yet finished. And during that time, the the over 75, 76-year-long struggle, the US-led global war against this small divided the nation, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. If anyone has any keen knowledge about the DPRK of its struggle, its long struggle for that many decades, it's some sort of, I tend to agree with the claim that the DPRK population say it's a history of non-stop miracles. Under unbelievable, unimaginable non-stop sanctions, the non-stop military threats, which is the nuclear war threats, non-stop the war games organized led by the Washington in the name of the US-South Korea joint military drills, and the sanctions, and an unimaginable degree of complete the blockade of this small divided nation for the crime of its stance to keep its independence, not being subservient, and to keep their own principle of being independent, self-reliant, with the anti-imperialist stance that they have never dropped, no matter what, under whatever the situations they were thrown into, they have never dropped that principle. And for that has been the crime that they have been forced to suffer with how many years? The 60, 70-year-long hardship, the food shortage, the energy, and the lack of energy sources. And as we know, till this day, that nation has not been allowed to the so-called free trade with its neighbors. As we know, since the end of 1991, when the Soviet was collapsed, and the dissolution of the Eastern European, the socialist bloc, the DPRK has been singled out. I've been to DPRK since 1989. My trips to as the Reunification movement activist, and later time, I've been teaching it at Kim Il-sung University since 2015, while I've been teaching at Tsinghua University in Beijing, China, with my own eyes, over 100 times visiting the North Korea. I think I know how hard, how difficult it has been the time they have survived, and without losing the right to self-determination, without losing the independence, without ever giving up the principle of the anti-imperialism. So having said that, my question came into this point that I have kept since 1991, when the Soviet was gone, when the European, the socialist bloc is also dissolved. How come that such a small nation, lack of energy sources, and the food shortage, as they call it in Korean language, 일심단결, meaning the whole nation is united under the leadership of the party and the head of the party. They call the head of the party and the Korea Workers' Party and the people, these three, the tripartite, the undeterred the unity, they call 일심단결, with the successful third leadership succession has been completed at the moment, the party chairman Kim Jong-un, without having that undeterred the leadership, starting from the late President Kim Jong-un, late the chairman the Kim Jong-il, their political, their national, their socialist, anti-imperialist policy has never been negotiated for the sake of their own survival. And I find an answer to my question, how they could have survived on the such a complete isolation and no hands from anybody, when particularly Russia and China, they themselves the struggling to come up with their own the stance. And it's a great for the sake of the humanity, not only for the DPRK, that under the president, Xi Jinping at the moment, since March 2018, the Xi Jinping has solidified, in my own knowledge, that it's like almost the same, similar, the political leadership style in the DPRK. And under his strong leadership, and China has, I call it, was able to regain its the anti-imperialist and socialist stance, and not anymore negotiating that principle with United States or anybody around the globe to negate that principle of independence, self-determination, and anti-imperialism. Let me focus on the another point I have been able to understand better about the Putin, the Russia, the new Russia under the President Putin, since his third term and now fourth term, how for example, Russia has been able to regain its sense of national dignity. Since Soviet was dissolved, the pride of great Russian nation lost the sense of pride, national dignity. I believe that under the Putin's leadership, the great Russian nation was able to rebuild their national pride in terms of independence, independent policy, not negotiating anymore their independent, the national policies based upon, I would argue, the anti-imperialism. And how? That I learned about the President Putin in his early years of leadership. July 2000, the Putin made the first time ever visit to Pyongyang to have the lead meeting with the late Chairman Kim Jong-il. And I was able to obtain some documents about that visit and their dialogue. And then since 2015, September 2015, the President Assad invited the invitation of Russian military emergency support for them to survive under the assault led by US, Britain, and plus Israeli, the proxy war against independent sovereign nation of Syria. And since 2015, the September, the world has learned about what kind of nation the Russia under Putin is all about. And I argue, it seems what I see in Putin's leadership, it's like under the Kim Jong-il leadership, they put the strategy called the military first politics, they call, or military first revolution. And no matter how hard their economic the situation, they never stop to build their own independent self-defense power. And having acquired their own independent national defense force, I mean now the nuclear deterrent power, they are now able to engage with any nation without losing their self-determination independence. And so with DPRK, China, Russia, I call it tripartite, the anti-imperialist, the nations alliance is the single most important in this 21st century to keep the world away from the global nuclear war. Because of these three independent, sovereign, anti-imperialist nuclear powers together as a political strategic alliance to deter US aggression, the world is safe from the disastrous the nuclear war, the possibility. So having said all, after 40-year long, the Korea War and the international peace and justice issues, the commitment, I come to a conclusion. I have become more optimistic. I am become ever more optimistic, but at this particular moment, with the indispensable role of these three nations, DPRK, China, and Russia, plus though the nuclear power, but the nations like the Iran, the Syria, and the Hezbollah together with the Russia as a nation, to save the Syria from being taken and by the international the military aggressions against the Syria. What about the brothers and sisters in Cuba? What about the brothers and sisters in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and Bolivia, around the globe? Any nation which try to stand on its own feet without losing their self-determination and independence, and trying to keep their national sovereignty, being challenged by US-led, the imperialist aggression still continues. But again, I'm ever more hopeful, I'm ever more optimistic, and grateful for the national leadership of the China, Russia, Iran, and other nations, together with the brothers and sisters in DPRK, the northern part of Korea. Again, I'm honored to be part of this meeting, and I hope to rejoin you in some other occasion. Thank you for the organizers, and thank you friends such as long time ago, the brother Keith Bennett in London. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for Dr. Chung, and thanks to Carlos for showing us the film. Now we go on to the final speaker, Sarah Flounders. Sarah is a longtime political activist and author based in New York City. She's the leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the International Action Center, and is the author of numerous books, including most recently, Capitalism on a Ventilator, The Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, co-authored with Lee Soo-hin, and NATO in the Balkans, Voices of the Opposition, co-authored with Ramsey Clark. She writes regularly for Workers' World. Sarah, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you to the International Manifesto Group. As the final speaker, I have a chance to recap a few points. First, who is responsible for the massive destruction of the Korean Peninsula? Not a building left standing in the north. US imperialism, we all agree. Who is responsible for the death of 5 million Koreans in the Korean War? And who's responsible for the division of Korea to this day? Since September 1945, who maintains this division, this forever war, this forgotten war? It's US imperialism. With tens of thousands of troops, Camp Humphrey, the largest overseas US military base in the world, and 72 other bases, they exist to keep Korea divided and to ensure decades of guaranteed profit to the US military industrial complex. Who is responsible for the economic sabotage and shortages, even of essential supplies of food and medicine in the DPRK today? 70 years of US sanctions. Now, US imperialism did not act alone. The British Commonwealth Army, for example, took part in the War of Korea. British, Canadian, Australian troops in the tens of thousands. And to this day, they politically defend their criminal role, and they play a role in the economic sabotage and sanctions. What is needed is a strong, clear, consistent voice of a united anti-war, anti-imperialist movement that stands with the people of Korea and against US war, sanctions, and the division of the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK deserves the support of all those who cherish self-determination and the right of every country to decide its own destiny. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea has refused to be intimidated by US imperialist government and its threats to the sovereignty and its socialist construction. From 1950 to 1953, the United States, using the cloak of the United Nations, bombed every structure in the North over one story. Millions were killed, and yet the Korean people would not bow down. And what's important is that US imperialism was stopped. They failed in this war. This war, they were determined to turn back the revolutionary wave that was sweeping Asia, not only Korea, but through China and Vietnam. This was their road into Asia, and they failed. So it's important to remember that this was a first big US imperialist failure. The forces led by Kim Il-sung liberated the North and began socialist construction, while US troops occupied the South and installed a whole series of corrupt, repressive governments. Now let's look at the role of the corporate media. From liberal to reactionary, their role is to discredit the leadership of the DPRK and cover up the amazing progress made by this socialist country. US strategy is to completely stifle and crush the sanctions, but crush through sanctions. But rather than being crushed, the leaders of the DPRK say that the sanctions, which are the hardest of any of the 39 countries where the US imposes sanctions, they're the harshest, but it's only strengthened the determination of the Korean people to defend their sovereignty. This small country has successfully learned how to become self-sufficient in many areas. Sanctions became less effective through Juche, through the DPRK's self-reliance. It's pretty amazing. And despite the new sanctions, there are multiple new construction projects that have been completed all over the country. There's glimmering high-rise districts in Pyongyang. There's new housing and schools and recreation areas in smaller cities and towns. There are greenhouses everywhere and urban agriculture. There are still difficult shortages and limited options, but the basic guarantees, DPRK has 100% literacy, the highest in the world, and healthcare is free. Now that is an incredible accomplishment. The crime is that the United States, one of the most highly developed countries in the world for over a century, can't yet provide decent education and medical care for its people. That's a crime. Now, what do we know from history? The Koreans are a distinct people who were united for thousands of years by language, culture, and geography, but they've been divided since 1945. We know that the DPRK will fight back if attacked. It has the will and the ability to defend itself. It's not going to surrender to threats. It never has. So how should we regard the nuclear capability of the DPRK? Well, it's a deterrent to a US attack, and it is therefore an anti-war measure. That's important to recognize. It was not the DPRK that introduced the first nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. During the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur actually proposed laying down a radioactive belt along the border with People's China. And since then, the Pentagon has organized semi-annual war games, they call them, by the US and South Korean military and everybody else they can possibly rope into it, that simulate an attack on the DPRK by nuclear-capable ships and planes. Now, the DPRK has studied other US agreements. They look at the world. They see that Iraq and Libya allowed outside inspectors to come in and verify the end of their weapons programs. And once they disarmed, then they faced the full force of NATO's immense firepower, resulting in over 1 million deaths in Iraq, and literally the return of open slave trade in Libya. How shameful, how outrageous. Now, the DPRK has never attacked the US. They have defended themselves against US aggression. The United States has sponsored a long line of military dictatorships in the South. But it is also important to recognize that the people's movement in the South did finally defeat the generals, and they at least ushered in civilian rule. This was a huge accomplishment. However, despite decades of a popular movement against military occupation, they are not yet able to rid the country of US troops and bases. That's why there's such a strong military presence in the South to this day. It's to stop. Today's occupation is a continuation of 150 years of US threats. The US war in Korea did not start in 1945. It started 150 years ago. In 1871, the US invaded Korea using gunboats, Marines, and superior firepower. It was US retaliation for the destruction of the heavily armed US gunboat, the General Sherman, 5 years earlier. This first warship was stopped by the Korean people. The Koreans surrounded this US warship with fireboats, small vessels stuffed with flaming straw and wood. They destroyed the invading Sherman and killed the whole crew. Now, this proud history with small fireboats, it continues today in the strike waves in South Korea. That's what they're like. They're like those small fireboats that continue. This past month, October 20th, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions called a one-day general strike. Tens of thousands demonstrated. Thousands of delivery workers turned off their apps and joined the strike. And what was their demand? The expansion of labor law to all workers, the abolishment of precarious work. Because after 70 years of capitalist development under US military and financial hegemony, a third of the workforce in South Korea are irregular, part-time, or temporary workers with few benefits. It's like the grim Netflix Squid Game, where millions are struggling to survive and pay crushing debt. So we need to think of solidarity with workers in US and other trade union organizations around the country, around the world, with the KCTU in their future actions. This kind of solidarity is crucial. Again and again, these waves of protests and of strikes have made significant changes, forced it through in the South Korean government. And it's important to recognize that South Korean people are largely supportive of peace with the DPRK, and they reject US provocations, and they seek to unite the peninsula. So in closing, I want to say it's also important to recognize that the DPRK has maintained a continuous position of dialogue and diplomacy with both Washington and Seoul, seeking to peacefully end the horrendous conflict that has divided the Korean people for over 70 years. In 1971, DPRK President Kim Il-sung proposed opening a dialogue between the North and South. In 1974, the Supreme People's Assembly of the DPRK proposed a formal end to the war. It was the US who ignored it. Progress was made again in 1994 with the official signing of the agreed framework between the DPRK and the US. The DPRK actually began to dismantle its uranium enrichment capacity. It was the US Congress who failed to meet its end of this signed agreement. They failed to help the DPRK develop peaceful nuclear technology for electricity generation. They failed to lift the sanctions and to normalize diplomatic ties. So, as I say, the position held by the DPRK for decades of inter-Korean dialogue, free from outside interference, is the way to achieve peaceful reunification and it's the only clearly viable option. We need to recognize that the Korean people have every right to be free from US and Western imperialist interference, and from here to make clear demands that the United States remove all military personnel and equipment from the region, that there must finally be a peace treaty with the DPRK. Sign the peace treaty. The DPRK has survived despite massive destruction, decades of heavy sanctions from the main global superpower, and people of the world stand with Korea's long struggle for reunification, peace, and development. Our demand is US out.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And first of all, many apologies to everyone that we have gone a little bit over time, but I personally think it's been entirely worth it. Now I see that one of our speakers, Derek Ford, has another appointment. So let's get the question and answer sessions going again. Let me request everybody who has questions to please raise their hands. I think you should be able to do it as attendees. Thank you. And while people are raising their hands, I will be taking 3 questions at a time and we'll go through a round of answers. But while people are thinking about their questions, let me just mention the International Manifesto Group and our manifesto. I'm putting in the chat 2 links. Here's one of them, and here is the other. Both of these are websites of the International Manifesto Group, and there you will find much of the work we've done. We've been going since the beginning of the pandemic, when some of us began to gather together to try to understand the multifaceted crisis of capitalism, imperialism, etc., that we are facing, not just a public health crisis, but a full-on economic crisis, a full-on crisis of capitalism and imperialism. And as we progressed and our discussions got deeper and wider, we began putting some of them on the website and then eventually began holding events. Earlier this year, we also decided that we should do what we had always set out to do, which is write a manifesto, because the purpose of all our discussions was always what is going on and what is to be done. These are the 2 overriding questions. So, and that's why we called ourselves the International Manifesto Group, because that's what we are about. We are about political action, about what is to be done. Eventually, we produced a manifesto. It is called Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism. It combines a socialist perspective with a very determined anti-imperialist perspective, which is absolutely critical today. I think you will agree. So I urge you all to take a quick look at the manifesto, consider reading it. If you like it sufficiently well, if you think you broadly agree, please consider signing it. And finally, please consider helping us to get discussions about its themes and related themes going around the world, because this will be a critical ingredient of the broader changes that I think we are seeing everywhere, which made, for instance, Professor Chung so hopeful as well. So with that, let me request questions. I see 3 here. So I'm going to one by one permit you to speak. So I'm going to I'm going to allow you to put your question, Jules. Go ahead.
Yes, I understand that, under the 1953 armistice, that the US and the UN control the DMZ in South Korea, and also that the US and UN are violating international laws when they put sanctions on North Korea. I mean, it's good to have these discussions and, keep the dialogue and everything. And my only thing is, like, isn't there an international lawyer, that we can get in touch with, like somebody that has knowledge in international law, and we can, Germany was able to reunify in 1990 using their own West Germany constitution. Like, this is a simple fix. All we need to do is go by South Korea and North Korea's constitution. We don't need permission from the US and the UN. Why are we sitting here talking about this like little
That's great, Jules. I think we got your point, and I'd request all people posing questions to be as brief as possible so that we can take as many questions and get discussion going. I hope that's okay, Jules. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you so much. Next, I have Anne. Please, Anne, go ahead and put your question. Anne, are you there? Okay, we will go then to Sarah. Sarah, please go ahead. Please place your question.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So I've been reading more about North Korea, the DPRK recently, and I've become interested in visiting at some point, obviously not super soon. And I know some people spoke about that. When I've expressed wanting to visit to people, like in my life, they said, like, because I want to see what's there and everything, they've said, oh, well, there was only like these tours, and so they're only kind of showing you what they want you to see. For those who have lived there or who have visited, I was wondering if you could speak to that, and who've maybe been on a tour, and I still think it's worth visiting, of course, but how would you maybe refute that? And thank you again to everyone for your talks. I really appreciate it. It was great.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And next I have Charles. Charles, please go ahead and put your question.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for fantastic presentations all around. I guess my question concerns the adoption of Juche historically. And my question is how much influence the Sino-Soviet split had on its adoption, in particular, the fact that the DPRK, saw its two neighbors to the north really at loggerheads, almost going to war on several occasions, obviously still confronting a fascist US-backed regime in the south, and also observing the sort of fratricidal warfare among socialist states in Southeast Asia, whether, or how much influence that had on, its pursuit of this very explicit, ideology of self-reliance.
Great, Charles. Thank you. Now, due to the fact that Derek has to leave first, I'm going to request him to answer whatever he can of the questions that have been posed, and also perhaps respond to anything that the other speakers have said, if that's what he would like to do. So, Derek, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Great questions, and thanks to all the panelists. It was really informative, and it's really great to be with you all. So, I mean, the first thing is that the thing about the law is that who makes the law, right? And who makes international law? Well, international bodies like the United Nations. So, it's kind of like if I wish it were simple in terms of like there was a legal case for it, right? I don't think Germany is a very good model because it wasn't really reunification so much as it was absorption. And it was actually a lot of force involved, right? Actually decades of force involved in that. And so there are legal structure, like there's a legal component to the struggle, absolutely. But ultimately what makes revolutions is force. And that includes legal force, but it also includes social force and economic force and political force. Now, I think you're absolutely correct to say that the Korean people and the Korean nation, right, is able to do this themselves. The problem is that the US blocks them from doing it, right? So even with, even the railway inspectors, right, from the South, they weren't able to go to the North to inspect the railways, right? And obviously, they need to be connected because then actually the South can have railways going to China, right? But the US wouldn't even let them visit, right? So the US is determining what Koreans can go where in Korea. And so I think, especially like I'm in the United States, I feel like the main thing we have to do is struggle, to restrain US imperialism in Korea, in Asia, and everywhere, which includes raising the consciousness of people, because people are very receptive to this because they know that the government lies to them about, everything, right? They're skeptical of the media. We have to sort of take that and bring them along. I think there's a really great opening for us. I think that there's a couple responses to the tourist thing. I mean, one, I don't know where the idea came about that as an American or as, a citizen of a Western country, I should be able to go to any country I want and do whatever I want, whenever I want. I think that there's a sort of arrogance to that we have to, and I'm not saying that the questioner had this arrogance, but, there's a sort of imperialist chauvinist assumption that I should just be able to go wherever I want. And especially when you consider the damage of tourism and imperialist tourism, it's basically like a form of sort of neocolonialism. So there are obviously, but also there's another element that's really about hospitality and a sort of cultural element, right? Which is like which has to do with caring for people and being with them, right? So it's not that people say, don't go there, don't do that, right? It's just they want to go with you because, they want to help you, right? And they want to sort of be there with you. That said, different tours have different degrees of sort of access, right? So one is their right to determine who comes in and who goes where. And two, there's different degrees of it. And three, honestly, going into North Korea was easier than going into the United States for me. Like going through customs was so much easier, right? And in fact, on the way back, a member of our delegation was actually detained at the US airport, right? That didn't happen in Korea. And I will let, was it Hugh or Keith who spoke about the Juche idea? I'll let them speak about that more. I really learned a lot, but I think, it does have to do with it, obviously. But I think that if we just sort of locate it within the Sino-Soviet split, we actually betray the Juche idea, right? Because we're saying that what happens in Korea is determined by what happens with these other major powers. And part of the Juche idea is actually, right, that like it's actually Korea itself, it's the people themselves who are the subjects of history, right? I mean, it's often translated as self-reliance, but another translation is subjecthood, right? Becoming the subjects of history rather than the objects of history. And so I think that's important when discussing it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Derek. And it's too bad you have to go, but that's our fault. We told you it was 2 hours. And so, okay. Other speakers, other panelists would like to respond to the question. Why don't you just jump in, perhaps? I think it might work if we do it that way. Who would like to go first? Sarah, go ahead.
I wanted to answer the first question. Why don't we just rely on get a lawyer and this could be so quickly solved? It's important to recognize that the US today is absolutely lawless, and they make no bones about it. This is true in the wars, in the invasions, in the countries they bomb, in the drone strikes they carry out, whether we're talking about the war in Syria or Korea. It does not matter, or drone strikes on Somalia, or new sanctions on Ethiopia. The sheer number of 800 military bases around the world, of the nuclear aircraft carriers, of sanctions on a third of the people of the world. 39 countries are being consciously starved down. They can't trade without their funds literally seized. This is lawlessness. It's in violation of UN Charter, US Constitution. So expecting law, but the Korean struggle has shown that the people themselves, that mass mobilizations can push back. So while we can't rely on lawyers at this point, I mean, the United States is kidnapping diplomats at this point. International immunity means nothing at this point. So the interventions around the world, not only in Korea, unless there's a global view of what's happening, and also a global view of people's resistance, that we see ourselves not as powerless, but we really identify with every struggle around the world that is resisting, and learn lessons from it, lessons from the ideas. That's why Juche is important, because the Korean people came up with a way to respond politically, ideologically, and materially. And that's worth looking at and reading from. And so at any rate, I just want to say that we should not be pessimistic. I think we have every reason to be optimistic, because every US war is failing, not only in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, throughout that entire region of Western Asia. But today we see a new determination in China that is really making a difference. And we see the continued determination in Korea. We see the collaboration with Belt and Road and China and Russia. I don't want to take too much time, but there are huge developments that are very encouraging for us to look at, to study. And at the same time, we see that this is an empire that is in decline and decay. It is unable to push its will anywhere. Now that makes it more ruthless. It's doing wilder things than it ever has, but it also means we need to have the long view and take heart and everywhere try to link our movement, because there's more potential in technology, as we see in this panel, but also in people's global consciousness. That's it.
Great, Sarah. I know, Xiangyu, you want to come in about the tourism question, so please go ahead.
Yes, I think it's a very valid question, but and I think it's a lot of the things, it's hard for people to imagine these things, but just think about this issue. The tourists who go into North Korea are comparatively rich, and that just puts them, it creates an inherent power imbalance between them and locals. If you look at the way, for example, people from the like the first world, the way they can conduct themselves, especially men from like the West, to be perfectly honest, in places like Southeast Asia or the rest of the global South, and especially in relations to women, for example, I think the DPRK is in fact protecting its people in this regard when they kind of, for lack of a better term, babysit tourists. Now there are different types of tours. Now you can go on like study trips with organizations like the KFA, or you can set up a private tour with KITC, and so what you see is it kind of depends on what kind of tour package you buy, just like if you travel on a tour to any other country. And the other thing is, when you travel to any other country, one example I like to say is Bali in Indonesia. If you're a tourist who goes there, what do you see besides for most people, you see the airport, you see your resort, and you see the roads in between. And another thing is the issue of their sovereignty. I mean, I have connections with people who work in tourism in the DPRK. So I've heard from people. South Korea has in fact sent northern defectors back to North Korea, posed as Chinese tourists with fake Chinese passports, to go in and liaise with their operatives who are in Pyongyang to get information and bring them back to South Korea, and they have been arrested in the north before. And the last issue was, it goes back to the presentation I made. If we want all of this to change, if we want more open access, and to be able to go to North Korea and just kind of go to anyone's, like, just make friends with anyone randomly and go to their houses, I think it's on the imperialists, it's on us, like in the outside world, to pressure the imperialists to end their aggression against North Korea. You end the hostilities against them, and they will be less paranoid, because the paranoia is very justified considering what's happened to countries like, like even in Cuba. I mean, look at the way liberalism has spread through the NED. It's a very valid concern. I think that's all I have to say.
Okay, great. Do any of the other panelists want to come in at this point?
Yeah,
go ahead, KJ. Please go ahead. And Keith, why don't you go next? KJ and then Keith.
I'll just answer very briefly the question about why it isn't simply a legal matter for South Korea and North Korea to reunite. Now, the simple fact is that the majority of South Koreans and North Koreans have relatives living in each other's parts of the country. This was an arbitrary split that was enforced and created by the United States. But the simple fact is that South Korea is not a sovereign state. It is controlled by the United States. I pointed out that it does not even have control over its own military. Operational control, is under UNC control, essentially under the United States under wartime, which technically the Koreas are still at war. South Korea was not even a party to the armistice. It was only between North Korea, China, and the United States. So that gives you a sense of the vassal status of South Korea. If a South Korean government were to try and engage with North Korea, the first thing that would happen is that South Korea still has laws on its books that prevent correspondence and relations with North Korea to this day. Clearly, the Moon Jae-in administration has been trying to move things forward, but he has been thwarted at every turn. And it has to do with the simple fact that you have a series of South Korean dictatorships and then dictatorship-derived extreme fascist governments that have been essentially supported by the United States. These are tremendously anti-North Korean, they're tremendously anti-communist. And from time to time, you will get a progressive administration, and they're almost invariably hobbled by the United States as far as their international maneuvering is concerned. It boils down once again to the fact that South Korea does not have an independent foreign policy.
Thanks very much, KJ. Keith, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this very brief and mention just one or 2 points. I want to, of course, endorse all the comments that have been made by the other panelists, particularly in their responses to these questions. But very briefly on each of the 3 questions. On the question of reunification, I think what we have to, the starting point that we have to begin with is that Korea was not divided by the desire or actions of any section of the Korean people themselves. Korea was divided by outside forces, principally by US imperialism, and it is US imperialism that maintains the division of the Korean Peninsula and the Korean nation to this day. If you remove the US occupation forces from South Korea, if you remove the US troops from all their bases surrounding the Korean Peninsula in Japan, Okinawa, Guam, and so on, the Korean people will have no trouble at all in sorting out what kind of reunified country that they want to live in. So for those of us, particularly for those of us who are not Korean, I think that's the issue that we have to focus on, is actually that the imperialist powers, our own imperialist powers, including Britain, which is where I am, which is an active and enthusiastic junior partner of US imperialism in this, that is our own governments that should cease their interference in Korean affairs and let the Korean people live the life they wish to lead in the way they wish to lead it. And I'd just like to, second point I want to make on this is that right back in 1980 at the 6th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, Kim Il-sung advanced the proposal for reunification, what he called the Democratic Confederal Republic of Korea, which is basically a one country, 2 systems idea that was later taken up by China for its circumstances, where he talked about there being 1 country, 2 systems, 1 state and 2 governments, which would allow the existing systems in the north and the south of the country to continue to exist. But of course, that doesn't preclude what the people, by their own struggles, would choose, how they would choose to live in the future. But it is the opposite from the German case, where the socialist GDR was swallowed up by the imperialist power, inflicting a misery on the people of the former German Democratic Republic from which they're yet to recover. On the question of visiting the DPRK and whether you see only what they want you to see and so on, well, people have made very good comments on this. I'd just like to remind people of what's been said by people in this meeting, that the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea are still in a state of war. The United States destroyed the north of Korea. It still threatens to destroy North Korea. The fact that the DPRK allows American citizens to visit the north of Korea is in itself quite remarkable under those circumstances. And let's also not forget it's actually the United States government that has introduced a ban on US citizens traveling to the DPRK. So I think, let's focus our campaigning and our activity on getting the United States to lift its ban on US citizens traveling to the DPRK. And then maybe we can have discussions about just what it is people can see. I have to say that when you go to the DPRK, you say, I want to visit schools, they'll take you to schools. I want to visit a farm, they'll take you to a farm. I would like to visit factories, you can go to factories. Can I land in just about any other country and make those requests and expect them to be granted? Very few. So, I really think that visitors to the DPRK get better access in that country than they do in most others. On the Juche idea, I think, I'm sorry, this is a big topic, so what I was going to say is going to be partial and incomplete. But we have to remember that the struggle in Korea began from its very origins and remains a struggle for both national independence and socialism. And I think that's really at the core of what makes it so relevant to what's been happening around the world, or the whole process of decolonization and national liberation and so on, and its relationship to socialism. That's one of the very interesting things about the Juche idea. So the Juche idea developed within the context of the Korean struggle precisely because it was a struggle for national independence, and it couldn't simply be a replica of the Soviet Revolution or even the Chinese Revolution, because the conditions were very different. What I think is the case, the Juche idea was developed in the course of revolutionary practice, but certainly the first public mention of it by the Koreans in the English language is a 1955 speech by Kim Il-sung, which is entitled more or less on eliminating dogmatism and flunkyism and establishing Juche in ideological work. And I think the date of 1955 is not insignificant, because the very first signs of tensions between the two great socialist powers were coming about. And there was a real question of how the DPRK, as a small divided country faced with imperialist aggression, was to deal with and survive and cope with the emerging difficulties between its two greatest and most important allies. So this, I think, underlined the fact that Juche became not simply a matter of policy, but of practical necessity, and was further developed in that course. And I think it is significant that of all the parties in the world communist movement, the Workers' Party of Korea is one of the very, very few that consistently both maintained its own positions and maintained its engagements with the two most important parties in the world communist movement, the Soviet and Chinese. So I think the Juche, in a word, is intrinsic to the Korean Revolution, but it served it well in the very, very complicated and difficult situation of the Sino-Soviet split. Thanks.
Great, Keith. And Hugh, did you want to come in and say anything? Okay, if not, I'm going to now.
I think Keith has said everything that I could have wanted to say. So.
Okay. We will take one more round of questions, and perhaps you will chime in there. What I see is I have 3 people wanting to ask questions, and after they're done, may I please request Carlos to look at the question and answer, the written questions and answers, and see if there are any that remain unanswered and that are important, and he can come in, and then we will have a final round of responses from the panelists. So first of all, may I ask Arslan to please put your question. Arslan, I have, yes, go ahead.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to ask the question. I'm very interested in the reunification and the Korean War. And so I know that I won't go to sleep tonight if I don't ask this question. So my question is, you have talked a lot about independence that North Koreans have won, that they have survived, but I don't quite understand what is this independence for? I mean, in what way are they independent from other countries, from USA as well? And how is North Korea different from South Korea in this way?
Thank you, Aslan. Next, I have Mawusi Ture. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you all. Thanks to all the organizers for this discussion and all the panelists. Just what I said in the Q&A, I really appreciate this discussion because it helped me to put in its proper political perspective why we had so many incidents of anti-Asian violence in the US earlier this year. For reasons many of you here already know, but certainly we know that the US encouraged that violence. So thank you all again, and for the work that you do. And if you want to comment on that, thank you very much.
That's great. Sorry. And finally, I have Vivian. Vivian, please go ahead. Please go ahead, Vivian. Can you hear us, Vivian? Can you say? All right. Maybe, Vivian, if you would like to, if you can't pose your question in person, could you please put it in the question and answer? And Carlos, would you please now pose any questions that remain unanswered and should be posed?
Sure. So there's quite a few that I think have been raised or dealt with during the round of Q&A so far. Sarah says, I'm a diaspora Korean born and raised in the US. And she asks about human rights abuses committed by leaders in the DPRK and asks, you know, are we saying all human rights abuses are lies created by mainstream US media, or are we supporting North Korea's goal of socialism without sanctioning or without approving of authoritarianism? Where should we draw that line? Aidan asks, when it comes to education in the South, how much is taught about the crimes committed by the US and South Korean forces during the Korean War? Bill asks, if unification was ever achieved, would the current leader in the North support a new democratic process for a new leader for one nation? Current news propaganda would suggest otherwise. Betsy asks, current campaigns to end the ban on travel to the DPRK by the US government are framed in a liberal or progressive context. How can revolutionaries engage in efforts to lift the travel ban as part of a wider revolutionary struggle? Joe asks, can one of the speakers please speak about the recent general strike in South Korea? To what extent is there a South Korean movement opposing US control over the South? Anonymous attendee has a slightly longer question that I'll try and condense. Given the Manifesto Group is a project for reviving socialism for the 21st century and learning from past successes and failures, I don't think holding up the DPRK as any kind of model is helpful or true. And they raise, for example, is there a cult of the personality? Is there ideological degeneration, etc.? And Mawusi just spoke and Arslan just spoke. So I think that's the open questions that we've got in the written Q&A.
That's great, Carlos. And I'll add a final one, which was in the chat, which is from Jeremiah Kim, who asks about what the American people can learn from the advancements gained by the Korean people's struggle for peace and against imperialism. And does this idea that Americans can learn anything positive from North Korea contradict the popular idea among the US left, which believes that a great proportion of the American people are irredeemable or inherently racist and chauvinist? So those are the questions, panelists, and perhaps we can go in the reverse order of the presentation. So beginning with Sarah.
Okay, I can't answer all of those points, but let me start with anti-Asian violence because it is so strong here in the US, growing daily. And it's because it's the easiest button for the ruling class and their media here to push. This is a country built on racism, on genocide of the indigenous people, on slave trade, on enslavement. So it is in the whole fabric of the society. And in every crisis, it is the first button that is pushed. The wars against Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, the threats on Iran, with that came an anti-Muslim and an anti-Arab racism that was so deep in terms of every Islamic center and mosque under scrutiny, and just hundreds of people rounded up, and I could go on, but the wars came with them such a fabric of anti-Muslim attacks and of anti-Arab attacks. And now, as the focus is on China, and the focus continues against Korea, we see in a way that happens so quickly, the way it unravels immediately, even people traveling on the subway, being in crowds, the attacks on Asian people are escalating. They're a daily occurrence. And it happens also with thousands of Chinese and other Asian workers suddenly deported and under special scrutiny. That is part of the racist climate that comes whenever the US focuses on war. Literally the expulsion, the breaking of agreements and contracts. So we should be really aware of and stand up to and address the anti-Asian racism and know how much it is part of the racism of the US. Now, I want to say a lot of the questions on how we would judge developments in Korea, of which we know so little, also have in them a deep Western arrogance that it's up to the people in the United States or Britain, Canada, I mean, really of the imperialist countries to decide the government and what the people of another country think and feel about their leaders and about the standards. So both it's a case of not buying into the propaganda, but it is also saying that Korea, without those tens of thousands of troops and military occupation, would be a very different country. It has culturally distorted Korea in the South, but it also has had an impact in the North, because if you're literally on a picket line, which is what it's like for decades at a time, where any break could weaken, in another way, it does distort people. That's true. We should recognize that. It's not that there is a paradise in the North, but there is a determination not to be overrun. And we gotta not put on those phony liberal glasses that they insist everyone in the West judge the people of Korea, North and South, with. The Korean people can decide this and rebuild their society if the US would get the hell out. So I always come back to that. I think that's where we gotta focus the movement. US out totally, and let the Korean people themselves decide. They have thousands of years of culture to draw on, and much that we could learn.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Next, Hugh, would you please respond to any and all questions you would like?
The phrase came in one of the questions questioning whether People's Korea could be taken as a model for other countries. Well, this is precisely something that, from the Juche point of view, would never be put forward. Every country, particularly those where national liberation has been, as Keith was pointing out, very much a part of their struggle, they express variety. I mean, our nearest major anti-imperialist movement in Ireland has totally different culture, and a united Ireland is going to look enormously different from, I'm sure, a reunited Korea. Cuba has been the closest ally throughout of people's Korea for a long time. And as everyone can see, their whole culture, their whole way of going about things, very, very different. I mean, just listen to a few seconds of their music of these different countries, Ireland, Cuba, Korea. They're all very different. Doesn't mean to say they can't appreciate each other, but what they appreciate is the fact that people are united, expressing themselves in their own independent character. That's where Juche is coming from, not setting models from one country to another. They've had enough of that. This also touches on the question we had from Charles right at the beginning, you know, that talking about the Juche idea solely in the context of the Sino-Soviet split, that sort of belittles it. Very much so. I mean, but it was general questions that were taken up by the Koreans at these different phases of history, regarding precisely this question of models, learning from others, and so on. Every revolution has something to teach. Every revolution has something that other people can learn from. But in the last analysis, you know, the Korean Juche idea was saying, well, people want us to, you know, to work out what revolutionary forces we're to rely on, how we are to use their abilities. And this is where the philosophy came in. Kim Il-sung was just saying, well, with us, we've got the Korean people. We can take it for granted that Korean people engaged in struggle are going to be enthusiastic about struggling for independence. We can take it for granted that they have their own creative abilities, which we have to rely upon if we're to implement anything politically, economically, or militarily. So this is where the philosophy comes in. He said, man, you can define man by three characteristics. Consciousness, we know all about that. An aspiration for independence can't be translated very easily into English. They often use the Korean word, song, and creativity. This is a new way of looking at people at this time. So certainly, the Juche idea can't be reduced to the idea of self-reliance, let alone self-sufficiency. It's an all-round new way of looking at the world. Can't actually be derived from the scientific socialism of the founded in the 19th century, but certainly doesn't contradict it, and certainly is predicated upon it.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Next, Xiangyu, please go ahead.
Well, both Sarah and Keith, you know, Keith hasn't spoken, Hugh, have done a very excellent job in responding to a lot of these questions, and I feel that I just have a little bit to add. Most of what I want to say have been said much more articulately by them than I could ever express myself. So I think on the question of whether or not there's anything from Korea that we can learn, I think one thing to really think about is the things that we observe. Are they innate to the DPRK, or are they responses to the circumstances that they're put under? I mean, it's do we want to look at them as a model? I mean, it depends on what. Do we want to have like free universal healthcare? Do we want to have free education on all levels? Do we want to have free housing? I mean, you look at sure, the some of the houses, especially in some of the less developed cities in the DPRK, aren't up to standard to let's say like a nice petty bourgeois neighborhood in the US, but at least there's no homelessness. I mean, isn't that something to thrive for? They're working with what they have. But at the same time, it's like I said in my presentation, you know, the limitations on certain freedoms. I mean, it's kind of hard to judge when your country is the one that's like kind of sanctioning them and depriving them of the material abundance that they deserve, and the just the room to maneuver politically. And another freedom that I think a lot of us don't really understand is that North Koreans have the freedom to be Korean on their own terms. But let's look at, for example, Haiti under the boots of US imperialism. Are they free to be Haitians on their terms, or are they only allowed to be Haitians on the terms of US imperialism? Now, to address the final question that I want to address about the human rights abuses and whatever, let's just assume that everything you hear about them is true. Let's just assume that Kim Jong-un does feed political dissidents to piranhas. Okay, let's look at the primary contradiction over here. I mean, if we look at the readings of Mao Zedong and during the struggle against Japanese imperialism, it was made very clear. Yes, the Kuomintang government and Chiang Kai-shek were very anti-people, but they were also the legitimate government of China at the time, and that to fight them and not the Japanese at that time, or for the KMT to fight the communists and not the Japanese, would mean the total subjugation, the complete subjugation of China to the Japanese imperialists. And the foreign boot is a lot more difficult to fight off than the domestic boot. I think that's one thing that we really need to think about. So even if we do believe that Kim Jong-un feeds people he doesn't like to dogs that have been starved for 2 weeks, I mean, do you think a Korea overrun by US imperialism will be better? I mean, that would mean there's no sovereign Korea to even fix.
Great, thanks so much, Xiangyu. And finally, Keith, please go ahead.
Right. Well, one of the things that Chairman Mao said that I very much agree with is that meetings should not go on too long. And, but the fact that this meeting's been going on for 2.5 hours and still so many people are on it and it's still fascinating, I think shows, just what an incredible job the other speakers have done here, and the great interest of that we've had so many people on this webinar. But taking into account the idea that yes, indeed, meetings should not go on too long, I don't want to take up much more time at all, because I think the other people who've responded to the latest round of questions have done so well that I just want to endorse everything they've said. What I would like to take up is one question that was, since Carlos read them all out, there was one new question that was added in the queue in the chat, which I noticed, which I'd just like to speak on very briefly. And somebody asks in the chat that would it not be to the DPRK's advantage to have a nuclear-free Korean peninsula? And I'll give you slightly more than one word, but to start with, I'll give you a one-word answer, and the answer is yes. Yes, it would indeed be to the DPRK's advantage and the advantage of everyone in the world if not only was the Korean peninsula nuclear-free, but the entire world was nuclear-free in terms of nuclear weapons. I think that's one of the things that we are all striving for, not least the Korean people, north and south. And I think one has to understand, as people have mentioned, that the United States has been threatening the DPRK and the Korean people with the use of nuclear weapons starting in 1950, and Sarah made reference in her presentation to what General MacArthur proposed of basically a nuclear annihilation of the DPRK, and in fact proposed also the nuclear annihilation of all the major cities in the Soviet Union and China as well, for good measure. Since those threats first made to use nuclear weapons in Korea in 1950, the United States has gone on threatening the DPRK with nuclear attack up to and including the present day. So the DPRK has consistently called for a nuclear-free Korean peninsula and has fought for it. The DPRK only went down the road of developing its own self-defensive nuclear deterrent precisely because of the US nuclear threat and the overall situation. And again and again in the West, when we talk about, when people in the West talk about denuclearization in Korea, what they mean is that the United States is that the DPRK should unilaterally disarm, and the United States should be free to do what it wants. And we've seen other speakers have referred to where that has led to in Libya, Iraq, and other countries. So, but what's very clear is, I mean, and this is how the Trump Kim Jong-un summit broke down in Hanoi, although it was, you know, more the doings of Mike Pompeo and particularly John Bolton than Trump, and that is the first and last decent half good thing you'll ever hear me say about Donald Trump, I promise. But what was the cause of the fundamental cause of the breakdown of the Hanoi summit was that when the United States understands denuclearization as meaning unilateral denuclearization by the DPRK. What the DPRK says is that they are engaged in a struggle for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which means the withdrawal of nuclear weapons from South Korea, from the US bases surrounding South Korea, and end to US nuclear threats, and a peace treaty and a normalization of relations. And on that basis, the DPRK can also talk about its denuclearization, because it's not a one-sided action to be taken by the victim without regard to the people who have caused the problem. And as the Chinese saying goes, that the one who tied the knot should be the one to untie it. And it's the United States that created a Korean nuclear issue. And I'd just like to make one final point on this, which is that around October the 10th this year, which is the anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party of Korea, there was a big national defense exhibition held in Pyongyang, and Kim Jong-un made an important speech there. And he said that our main enemy is not the South Korean authorities or even the United States. Our main enemy is war itself, and that the possession of advanced military deterrent on the part of the DPRK is precisely to prevent war. And indeed, I think you can very well argue that it is that has prevented war on the Korean Peninsula. Why is it that Iraq, Libya, Yugoslavia, and so on, Somalia and other countries were destroyed? They were destroyed primarily because they were defenseless. And the DPRK has learned that lesson, and I'm sure is determined to not forget it. So sorry, I ended up talking too long.
Not at all, Keith. I thought that was really a very important question to take up, and I think you did that really well. So thank you very much. I would like to bring this meeting finally to a close with a few brief points. First of all, thanks to all the wonderful speakers. You have been so wonderful. You can see in the chat, people have not only sat for over 2.5 hours, but they want more. So perhaps we will be returning to you to do another panel, as has been suggested, on reunification or some related subject. So please watch this space for that. Let me also thank the co-sponsors of this event. No Dut Dol, Chiao Collective, Friends of Socialist China, International Action Center, and the United National Anti-War Coalition. So thank you all for sponsoring this. And by the way, links to all of these organizations are on our website if you want to check them out further. And finally, let me end this meeting with one final appeal to check out the manifesto. I should add also that the manifesto you will find has been translated into several languages. Once again, the title is Through Pluripolarity, which is, we consider, a very profound anti-imperialist vision. Through pluripolarity towards socialism. And as I say, and thanks to completely volunteer work and enthusiasm of lots of people, it has already been translated into many languages. Since we're talking to probably a lot of people involved with Korea, we would love to get a Korean translation. So if there are any takers, please get in touch. And as I say, please consider reading it. It's about an hour-long read, and consider supporting it. And please be in touch if you would like to work with us. So having said that, please also check out the website for our future events. and hope to see you there very soon. I know that we are going to, actually, I will ask Carlos to make a brief announcement about another event which we are doing, which is quite important and which should interest many of you. Carlos, please go ahead.
Sure. Well, assuming we're talking about the same event, then
the Summit for the Democracies.
Yeah, the Summit for Socialist Democracy. So probably people here are aware that the Biden administration has announced that it's going to hold a Summit for Democracy on the 9th and 10th of December. And their view is to bring together leaders from government, civil society, and the private sector to set forth an affirmative agenda for democratic renewal and to defend against authoritarianism, i.e., they want to consolidate a capitalist, imperialist club against China, against the DPRK, against Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Russia, Iran, and so on. So we're having essentially a counter summit. It's organized jointly by the Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group. It will be held on Saturday, the 11th of December at 9 a.m. US Eastern Time. We've got confirmed speakers include Chung Fu from China's Academy of Social Sciences, Carlos Ron, a Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs for North America from Venezuela, Isabel Monal from Cuba, Luna Oy from Vietnam, Professor Chung from Korea, who spoke earlier, Layla Brown from Northeastern University, Elias Jabor, Roland Boer, Danny Haifong, and Radhika will moderate. So it should be a really interesting event. Hope to see you there, and I will post the link in the chat now.
Thank you so much, Carlos. So with that, and with, again, another round of thanks to all the speakers. Thank you. You've really made this event, and we're looking forward to further events like this. Oh, and one final point. On December the 5th, many of you will be interested in an event on China and Africa. So please watch out for that. We are in the process of preparing the website and the Eventbrite page, and we will be publicizing it as well. So thanks very much, and bye-bye.